President Trump has issued one of the starkest warnings of this crisis so far, saying Iran has just 48 hours to make a deal or face what he described as a devastating response. That statement is now at the center of a rapidly escalating confrontation involving the United States, Iran, Israel, and the wider Middle East. And this is not just rhetoric floating in a vacuum. It comes at a moment when an American airman is still being searched for after a U.S. jet went down, when global oil markets are already under pressure, when the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the world's most dangerous choke points, and when every hour seems to bring a new headline that raises the stakes even further. What makes this moment so consequential is that Trump's warning did not arrive in isolation. Bloomberg reports that Trump warned Iran it had 48 hours left, while the missing airmen remained unaccounted for. Al Jazeera separately reports that Trump said hell will rain down on Iran if Hormuz is not reopened by Monday. The New York Times adds another critical layer, reporting that the United States is still searching for a missing crew member as Trump repeats threats linked to the strait. Put those together, and the picture becomes clearer. This is not simply about one quote. It is about a cluster of military, diplomatic, and economic pressures all colliding at once. To understand why the 48-hour warning matters, you have to start with the event that changed the tone of everything, the downing of a U.S. fighter jet over Iran. Bloomberg says Trump's victory rhetoric has been undercut by the downed U.S. jet in the Iran war, and it specifically reports that one airman remains missing. The New York Times confirms that the search for the missing crew member is ongoing and notes concerns that Iran could gain leverage if that individual is captured or detained. That concern is not theoretical. The Times explicitly points to Iran's history since 1979 of using detained Americans and Europeans as leverage in negotiations with more powerful adversaries. In other words, the missing airman is not just a military concern, it is also a geopolitical flashpoint. This is where the timeline becomes especially important. Trump publicly framed the situation as a closing window. Bloomberg's wording is that Iran has 48 hours left. Al Jazeera's wording is that severe consequences will follow if the Strait of Hormuz is not reopened by Monday. Those may sound like two separate threats, but they are deeply connected. One is about time, the other is about a condition. Together they communicate a simple message. The White House wants movement from Iran, and quickly, on both access and de-escalation. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping route. It is one of the world's most strategically important waterways. Roughly a fifth of global oil trade typically passes through it. That is why Bloomberg has multiple reports focused on Hormuz, including one saying the United States doubled Hormuz guarantees to $40 billion with new partners. Bloomberg also reports that weekly transits have reached their highest level since the war began, suggesting that governments and markets are scrambling to adapt even as the threat environment remains unstable. When leaders talk about Hormuz, they are not only talking about military access. They are talking about fuel prices, food costs, airline routes, shipping insurance, inflation, and the day-to-day financial pressure that can ripple from the Gulf into nearly every household in the world. That is already happening. Bloomberg reports that the Middle East conflict is weighing on global food prices, and that France is considering fuel-related support for businesses hit by rising costs. Turkey, Bloomberg says, is weighing energy price increases as the Iran war rattles markets. South Korea is considering wider driving restrictions if oil climbs above certain levels. Lufthansa is warning of potential fuel shortages if the conflict drags on. This is one reason the 48-hour ultimatum carries such weight. It is not just a military countdown. It is also an economic countdown, because every additional day of instability around Hormuz compounds the global impact. At the military level, the administration appears to be pairing its rhetoric with visible posture. Bloomberg reports that the U.S. has deployed the bulk of a stealthy long-range missile system for the Iran war. The U.S. Central Command website adds important official context. CENTCOM posted multiple updates related to what it calls Operation Epic Fury on March 2nd and March 8th, 2026. It also issued a March 11 warning telling civilians to avoid ports used by Iranian forces, and on March 8th it issued a safety warning to civilians in Iran. Those details matter because they show that public military messaging has been active and sustained. Even more importantly, CENTCOM on March 31st specifically refuted media claims of U.S. strikes in Lamerd, Iran. That tells us something crucial for fact-checking. In a fast-moving conflict, not every viral claim is confirmed, and official denials need to be noted as part of the record. The administration's military messaging has also been shaped by losses and accidents. CENTCOM confirms that a U.S. KC-135 was lost over Iraq in March, with all crew members later confirmed deceased. It also reported a friendly fire incident in Kuwait involving 3 U.S. F-15s, though the pilots were safe. These incidents are not directly the same as the downed aircraft over Iran, but together they paint a picture of a highly active and increasingly dangerous operating environment across the region. When Trump now talks about 48 hours and raises the prospect of massive retaliation, he is doing so against a backdrop where the U.S. military is already deeply engaged and has already suffered serious incidents. There is another reason the missing airmen matters so much. It changes the domestic political and strategic equation in Washington. A threat can be walked back, a lost aircraft can be reframed, but a missing service member creates urgency that leaders find very hard to ignore. The New York Times reports that concerns are rising because Iran has a long history of using detainees as bargaining chips. Fox News coverage, while more overtly framed, also points to expert concern that search and rescue operations are being complicated by an increased presence of Iranian forces. Whether one follows Reuters, Bloomberg, The Times, Al Jazeera, or Fox, the common thread is the same. Time is becoming politically and militarily expensive. Now, there is an important distinction to make here if we want to stay factual and policy safe. Trump's language is dramatic, but the exact form of any future U.S. response remains unknown. No verified source in the material provided confirms a specific, finalized plan for a new strike package tied to the 48-hour statement. What is confirmed is the threat itself, the ongoing search for the missing crew member, the importance of Hormuz, and a visible U.S. military posture in the region. So the accurate way to frame this is not to predict a certain attack. It is to say the warning increases the likelihood of rapid escalation if the stated conditions are not met. That is where Trump's political positioning comes into focus. Bloomberg says his victory rhetoric has been undercut by the downed jet. The New York Times says Trump pledged a quick end to the war in Iran but has not explained how. That creates a tension at the center of the story. On one hand, the administration wants to project strength and urgency. On the other, the battlefield and diplomatic realities are resisting a clean narrative of control. If an airman remains missing, if Iran can still fire back, if Hormuz remains contested, and if global oil markets continue to react, then the image of swift dominance becomes much harder to sustain, and Iran still has options. The New York Times reports that Iran's defenses have been struck, but that they can still fire back. Al Jazeera reports preliminary death toll figures in the broader U.S.-Israel attacks on Iran at 2,076 dead in Iran, at least 24 in Israel, 13 U.S. soldiers, and 27 killed in Gulf states. Those figures are from Al Jazeera's live tracker and should be understood as preliminary and conflict-era reporting, but they underscore the scale of the crisis. This is not a contained exchange. It is a regional war environment with losses across multiple countries and multiple fronts. The humanitarian implications are easy to lose when political rhetoric dominates the headlines, but they remain central. Reuters reporting from the broader Gaza-related regional context notes that UNRWA's head is seeking an investigation into the killing of more than 390 employees during the 2-year Gaza war, calling it the deadliest conflict in the global body's history for its own staff. Reuters also reported on renewed fatalities in Gaza and the West Bank, even after a U.S.-brokered ceasefire had been in effect for months. These stories matter because the current Iran escalation is not replacing the other crises in the region, it is stacking on top of them. That means leaders making decisions in Washington, Tehran, and Jerusalem are doing so in a region already saturated with trauma, displacement, and fractured diplomacy. Reuters also reports that Hamas told mediators it would not discuss giving up arms without guarantees that Israel would fully withdraw from Gaza, as envisioned in a disarmament plan from Trump's Board of Peace. Reuters says that plan would disarm Hamas in stages over 8 months and require the destruction of Gaza's tunnel network. This matters because it shows that while Trump is issuing ultimatums to Iran, his administration is also trying to shape a post-ceasefire order in Gaza. The result is a highly compressed strategic agenda: military confrontation with Iran, pressure on Hamas, security coordination with Israel, and economic stabilization tied to Hormuz. Any one of those would be difficult. Managing them all at once raises the risk of miscalculation significantly. Then there is the global market dimension. Bloomberg's coverage makes clear that oil is not just reacting to headlines, it is reacting to the possibility of prolonged disruption. Charting the global economy, oil storms higher on war escalation is not just a colorful headline, it is a concise summary of how investors, shipping firms, central banks, and governments are reading the risk. Rising fuel costs affect trucking, agriculture, aviation, manufacturing, and food distribution. Bloomberg also reports that the FAO says the Middle East conflict is weighing on global food prices. In plain language, this means a military threat exchanged in Washington and Tehran can end up affecting grocery bills in cities far removed from the Gulf. The aviation impact is equally serious. Bloomberg says the Iran war is reshaping global aviation. Airlines do not need a direct hit to feel the consequences of war. They reroute, burn more fuel, face longer flight times, pay more for insurance, and absorb operational disruptions. That eventually reaches consumers too. So when Trump frames this in terms of a 48-hour deadline, the whole world hears it through multiple channels at once: military, diplomatic, financial, and practical. Europe's response shows how nervous allies are becoming. Bloomberg reports that France and Britain are exploring ideas around Hormuz, and that Italy's prime minister is in the Gulf to bolster energy supplies hit by war. Al Jazeera reports that Italy's Giorgia Meloni met the emir of Qatar to discuss energy issues amid the Iran war. These are signs that allied governments are not treating Trump's threat as mere theater. They are preparing for supply shocks and a potentially prolonged disruption. Inside Iran, the pressure is also intensifying. Al Jazeera reports that a projectile hit near Iran's Bushehr nuclear plant, killing one worker, citing the IAEA. The New York Times also notes that a projectile hit near Bushehr and killed a worker. This is one of the most sensitive developments in the entire crisis because incidents near nuclear-linked facilities generate immediate international alarm. Even if there is no larger nuclear event, the political symbolism and risk perception are enormous. It raises questions about red lines, escalation control, and whether outside powers can prevent military operations from drifting into even more dangerous territory. Trump's rhetoric is clearly aimed at leverage, but rhetoric can create traps as well as pressure. If Iran does not comply, and if the White House has publicly staked credibility on the countdown, then pressure builds on Washington to act. If Washington acts, pressure builds on Tehran to respond. If Tehran responds in or around Hormuz, global markets react again, regional governments get drawn in further, and shipping and energy infrastructure face even more strain. That is why this moment feels less like a single turning point and more like a narrowing corridor with dangerous walls on both sides. There is also a messaging battle underway about who is escalating and who is deterring. Bloomberg says Trump warns Iran time is running out to make a deal or open Hormuz. Al Jazeera frames it more starkly as a threat of severe retaliation if Hormuz is not reopened by Monday. The New York Times emphasizes the search for the missing crew member and the risks of Iranian leverage. Those are different editorial angles, but they all describe the same core reality. The United States is trying to force movement quickly while under visible pressure from military setbacks and an unresolved rescue operation. For viewers trying to make sense of this, the most important thing is to separate verified developments from speculation. Verified, Trump publicly issued a 48-hour warning, according to Bloomberg and Al Jazeera. Verified, a U.S. aircraft was downed and one crew member remains missing, according to Bloomberg and the New York Times. Verified, Hormuz is central to the confrontation, and the United States has increased guarantees tied to shipping security, according to Bloomberg. Verified, CENTCOM has publicly issued updates, warnings to civilians, and denials of at least some reported strike claims. Verified, the conflict is already affecting oil, food, transport, and broader economic conditions. What is not verified from the provided material is the exact nature or timing of any next U.S. strike if the deadline passes. That uncertainty is not a gap in understanding. It is the reality of the moment. Sometimes the most honest analysis is not to pretend we know what comes next, but to define the pressures that make escalation more or less likely. So what happens if the 48 hours expire without a deal or a reopening of Hormuz? 3 broad possibilities stand out. 1. Back-channel diplomacy produces partial movement, enough for both sides to claim some measure of success and delay immediate escalation. 2. The United States responds with limited military action designed to restore deterrence without triggering all-out regional war. 3. The crisis spirals, with retaliation and counter-retaliation hitting energy routes, military assets, or regional infrastructure. None of those outcomes is guaranteed, but all are more plausible now than they were before the ultimatum. There is one final point that should not be overlooked. This story is not just about leaders and threats. It is also about ordinary people who will bear the consequences of whatever happens next. If Hormuz remains unstable, households pay more for fuel and food. If military operations expand, civilians in multiple countries face greater danger. If a missing airman becomes a bargaining chip, diplomacy hardens and trust collapses further. The costs are not abstract. That is why Trump's 48-hour message matters so much. It compresses time, it raises expectations, it narrows room for ambiguity. And in a conflict zone already defined by fear, loss, and rapid escalation, compressing time can be one of the most dangerous things any leader can do. Right now, the countdown is not just on a clock in Washington. It is playing out in the waters of Hormuz, in search operations for a missing American crew member, in oil markets, in military command centers, and in the calculations of governments across the region. Whether this ultimatum produces movement or a deeper crisis may become clear very soon. Until then, the most responsible conclusion is also the simplest one. The rhetoric has sharpened, the stakes have risen, and the margin for error is getting smaller by the hour.